Back software underpins the transformation in the health IT sector in the federal government that you learned about in the first part of this program. The way the government gets, uses, and maintains that software is different now than it was just a few years ago. Andrea Fletcher is Chief Digital Strategy Officer and Director of the Digital Service, the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid. Sachin Agrawal is Chief Executive Officer at eVisit. Welcome, both of you. Thanks for joining me. Andrea, I start with you. You used a term recently that I think is interesting. You said CMS is opening up our code.
Yeah.
What code are you opening, and why is that important?
Yeah, so at CMS, we write a lot of software, right? And we've had a long history actually at the agency of building open source software. So building software that we actually build in the public with other people using open source repositories and packages, because we work a lot with the private healthcare sector, right? So the best examples of this are called Blue Button 2.0 or data at the point of care. These are bulk FHIR, FHIR, APIs that, this is a lot of acronyms.
Yeah,
I'm
that's
sorry.
Okay. No,
I'm going to try
right.
to de-acronym as we chat. But basically it allows people to download Medicare beneficiary data. And why that's important that we're building it in the open is it allows for an ecosystem of different organizations to work with our data. Big companies, small companies, and it allows us to do it in a way where everyone has equal access to that software. And so we've stood up the first open source program office in the federal government. It was announced by the National Cyber Director in a recent report, kind of encouraging open source software in the federal government, and have built a small team at our agency who support across all of the centers and offices that we have, teams who want to open up different work that they're doing. And so not only do we have these APIs, we build our websites on Drupal, which is open source software. We have just released some of the data analysis code for the Medicare beneficiary survey, which is a long-running survey that we do. So analytic products, websites, tools to analyze data. And we're big fans of this, one, because it makes it more secure. We're scanning our code, we're looking at our code before we publish it. We have extra eyes every time we release it to the public. We have other people looking at it. Many eyes makes less bugs, right? So they'll say, hey, I think there's a bug in your software, here, fix it. And we're actually introducing new programs to keep an eye on that software after we launch it, right? And so it's a cybersecurity posture, as well as building a sharing ecosystem in the healthcare space, where others can build on top of the work that we've done.
Did you run into resistance as you were building that culture, or has it been inculcated long enough at CMS that people didn't really give you a hard time when you wanted to scale?
It's been there long enough at CMS. I think this has kind of been a long time coming, and pockets of the agency were really mature, and what we are focused on at the OSPO is making sure that the rest of the agency can catch up to the mature teams that are launching lots and lots of open source software on a regular basis, and that we're providing training and support and templates and tools for the rest of the agency, and kind of raising the floor. And that's been the exciting part of this, is that we were already doing this, and it's just how do you take the best practices and scale those across the agency.
Sachin, welcome. It's great to have you on the program. You were talking before we went on the air about the free flow of data and the data exchange that's important in these digital transformations that organizations are undertaking. It sounds like that syncs with the kind of thing that Andrea is talking about at her agency.
I think it's critical. I mean, Andrea, what you're doing at the scale of CMS is going to unlock value for the entire ecosystem. If you look at these major, we think of them as the major pillars that are being put in place across the industry, the electronic health records, other core systems. If you don't have data transferability between them, if you don't have the ability to look at somebody kind of longitudinally, not only are you going to have access issues in terms of getting information, but if we think about the kind of underlying crisis that's going on in this country, is that we still have been treating healthcare episodically rather than across the continuum of care. Nobody has a healthcare episode, right? Mm-hmm. We all have healthcare needs that develop and progress and change over time, and so to think about the data flowing relative to how we actually experience healthcare is critical.
What does that mean, Sachin, for the way that people should be thinking about building infrastructure, not just at CMS, but all across the federal government? And again, with that kind of latitudinal and longitudinal approach that we talked about in the first part of this program, which is the providers in the federal government, but also the private sector organizations like the ones that Andrea talked about partnering with.
Yeah, this is a topic of some controversy amongst the commercial providers of electronic health records, right? There are different postures on the willingness to be open with APIs, as Andrea mentioned, and you know, willingness to access data, because it opens up a significant question on who actually owns and controls that data. But you know, to answer your question, Francis, I'm a big proponent of open APIs. It's what we do at our company. Our expectation is that as more data is created, this idea of interoperability actually needs to go on steroids, so that you're integrating in and out of other systems and being able to provide that contextual view of any individual, not just for that patient's benefit, but we heard in our last segment that providers are frankly under duress, and that's not an episodic thing that's happening in this country. That's not a crisis. That's sort of the new normal. You know, we're estimating that over the next decade, the provider shortage is just going to continue growing up to over 100,000 physicians by the mid-2030s. And so if we don't think about structurally solving that through unburdening their limitations that happen when they don't have access to data, then we're simply going to add to that crisis.
The term that you're using to describe that is healthcare desert, similar to what we hear about food deserts. Are those the factors that are leading to what you use that term to describe, Sachin?
Yeah, I mean, if you think about it, we are not going to be graduating more people from medical school and nursing school than we really can be, right? That's not going to be the major rate factor that changes. And we should have, if we are more efficient about it, we should have enough providers in this country to serve the population. We are, you know, the most advanced, largest country in the world in that sense, and yet just putting a military lens on it, right? There's a recent NPR report that came out that over 45% of you know, military beneficiaries are in a federally defined healthcare desert, and that's going to hit the people with polychronic situations going on. It's going to hit the maternity population, which is already happening more broadly in the industry, and so we're not doing the people who are sacrificing a lot for this country, we're not doing them a service at all, right, at not some small scale, but we're talking about half of beneficiaries that sit in these deserts. And so we have to think about not solving it through the old ways of adding more expensive brick and mortar and human capital infrastructure, but there has to be a digital alleviation of that pressure point.
So one of the elements of that digital alleviation that you told me recently, Andrea, you said without open source, you can't have AI. Why is that, and how does one move from one to the next?
Yeah, oh man.
Or am I maybe not even thinking about it right?
No, I mean, the way I think about it is the foundational models of AI we're all built in an open source ecosystem. It takes a lot of resources and infrastructure and a lot of research projects, which many of these models start out as open source projects where people are working across the ecosystem. And for me, when I think about the government doing AI, one of the biggest risks, and we hear often people are scared of, is lack of transparency, lack of knowing what's in the algorithm, what's in the box, right? People keep using the analogy of a black box. We don't know what's in it. We can't see it. How do we build transparency? And the only way I know how to do that is to do it in the public, do it in the open, and be transparent just in the way that we're actually building the code. So use the foundational models that are open source and do our fine tuning, do the actual training of these modules in the open as much as possible. And so that's, you know, one, it's part of how you got AI, how we got here to this moment that we're in, which I think is a pretty pivotal moment, that the large language models in particular have become very robust and are being used in many different use cases in the healthcare sector and in our economy at large. But what does this look like moving forward as a government entity or as a government agency? How do we make sure that we're being transparent and open and also maintaining trust with the public? And the only way that I think we can really do that is by having a really robust open source posture.
What do we do with that open source posture then to maximize this pivotal moment as you described it? What are the things that you see coming, or is it do we not know yet? Because, I mean, 2 years ago, we didn't know artificial intelligence was necessarily going to have the kind of impact that most people think that it will have now.
It was under different flavors or different names.
That's right.
You know, like we've been doing machine learning for, you know, well over a decade at CMS. I think what's going to change is our expectations of what is it being used for, right? I personally keep running into this experience in my own life right now where I keep getting AI assistance whenever I try to contact customer service, right? And it's a terrible customer experience service. You spend the whole time trying to talk to a human and not talk to the AI.
Yeah.
And that's what we want to avoid, right? We want to avoid making the process for our general public and our beneficiaries worse because we toss an LLM on it and now it's supposed to be more effective and efficient and it's not, right? So I don't know if that fully answers your question, but where we're going is understanding the use case and then building that software, building that tool that we're going to use, that AI model in a way that allows people to trust it, right? Right now, there's a huge lack of transparency in this space.
I share your desire to just rage press 0 until I get to a human. Sachin, you wanted to add something to what Andrea was talking about there.
Well, spot on. I'd also add from a technical perspective, all AI/LLM models are actually designed to fail unless you feed it with more data, right? More learning to do. And if we create this wall between any beneficiary who interacts with the government or primarily interacts with the government versus patients who interact with the private sector and only let the private sector sort of lead, then these models will be trained to serve that model of care. And kind of going back to, we have unique healthcare deserts that are, a military beneficiary at a base who is pregnant and may not have access to postpartum care. And our maximization of this technology is dependent on making sure that data about that person is made available to train the model.
What is the right role, in your view, for industry and government to work together? And is there a way to think about who does what, or does that not matter as much as there is a strategy, which we'll talk about later in this program, and that wherever the pieces fall, they fall? Do you get what I'm going for there?
I do. I think both matter. It's from my perspective, a matter of sequencing. There are things that we're talking about that, because it's big and a big ship to turn, that the government is just getting into now, that we can learn from what the private sector has been doing. Meaningful use has been around for coming up on 20 years now, and so providers have had to adopt electronic health records. Otherwise, their reimbursement from Andrea would have been disrupted, right? And
well, she's not writing the checks, but I get what
I don't personally write them.
You told me that you write the checks.
I get what you're going for.
Yeah, and so there are, out of frankly need, right? There are things that health systems and providers around the country are doing that we can learn from. There are also things that they have done ineffectively that we can learn from now that we're doing electronic health modernization and digital first and these sorts of things. So I think that's one area, and coming from more of a private sector background and spending more time with the government, I do see a lot of opportunity for better collaboration there. But then going back to your question, are there structural things that could be done too? We have a supply-demand mismatch in this country in terms of people's ability to access care, and that supply-demand mismatch is exasperated in areas like the VA or active duty military. And so are there things that we could do where the private sector is making capacity available in those situations, and they're doing so in a way that is on their terms without sacrificing their patient populations and their needs? And so I also think technology is sort of the great hope there in order to see some of that smoothed out.
Andrea, at the beginning of the conversation, you talked about how open source facilitates cybersecurity.
It does, yeah.
You have done a bug bounty program with the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. What were you aiming for there, and what did you learn from that process? Yeah,
so at DEF CON this year, we launched a vulnerability disclosure program first, which is a safe harbor. So we run large-scale websites at CMS, healthcare.gov, medicare.gov, medicaid.gov, to name a few. And so we worked with CISA. CISA has a program where we were able to join them in basically asking the hacking community, take a look, or the security researchers to take a look at these websites, and that we would sign up as part of their vulnerability disclosure program, and that we would close those bugs quickly. So if they're reported to us, we made a commitment that we would get them cleaned up fast. And that has been incredibly successful. We followed that up working with their bug crowd program. And to me, so this is being led by our open source program office. And part of what's exciting about having our kind of, like, we call it source code stewardship. So making sure we know where our code is, who's in it, and what it does, is part of that. And then having ways of, hey, you're, submitting bug requests to us and pull requests, and that we have ways, if you find something that might be leaking PII or PHI, or something that is a real, like a serious vulnerability that we should know about fast, that we have a way for you to get that. And in fact, bug bounties are awesome because we pay people for them, right? So it's much more beneficial for us to pay people up front for bugs than to deal with the aftermath. And so it's a much more less reactive, more proactive approach to cybersecurity, and a new way of thinking about it. There are very few agencies that have signed up for this program with CISA, and I think it's a wonderful program. It's funded through CISA, so it costs us $0, which everyone in government
loves $0.
They always love when the cost is zero.
Huge fan of that.
Yeah, $0 to join their vulnerability disclosure program, and it's a great way when you think about how the government engages with that community as well, the security research community or the hackers, that we're kind of all in one place. They can go, they can see who's going to pay out, who's not paying out, and they can actually support us in a new way. I think it's a cool idea. I mean, and it's fun. It's a fun program to run.
Yeah, I would think just the fact that you were at DEF CON is. I mean, that's kind of counterintuitive to the way that I would think about a civilian government agency.
Yeah, Medicare is at DEF CON, right?
That's right.
Yeah, we were there with ARPA-H.
What do you learn at an event like that applies to what CMS does on a mission delivery basis every day?
Yeah, I mean, the way the internet works it's changed a lot. I mean, I think I was listening to something this week where they talked about the dark web being like the third largest economy in the world now, right? And Medicare beneficiary data is very sought after data, for example, for Medicare fraud. And so making sure that our leadership and our staff understand what is happening and what the trends are in cybersecurity is critical for us for Medicare fraud, waste, and abuse. It's critical for us for making sure that we're protecting our programs and that we're able to keep these websites up and running and productive, and protecting our beneficiaries. It's no longer a world in which somebody is stealing a piece of paper to get your information. It's all happening online. And so making sure that we are part of that understanding, that I think a big part of it for us is making sure our leadership and people who are running these programs understand the risks that are out there, and how the internet works, right? Because it's really what it's about. It's how the internet works today.
I mentioned at the beginning of this part of the conversation, Sachin, that the way that organizations in government and in the private sector think about software is different now than it was a couple of years ago. Should they also be thinking about infrastructure then differently based on what Andrea just said?
Absolutely. I mean, infrastructure used to be a hardened, capital expenditure that you amortize over a 15, 20, 25-year period, right? That's the sort of classic definition of infrastructure. If you apply what Andrea just said about cybersecurity to that paradigm, it would take about 6 minutes for the infrastructure to be penetrated, right? So for us to think about infrastructure being an asset that's continuously evolving, literally the opposite of depreciating, right? But continuously getting more valuable over time, I think is where we have to go if we're going to enable all the data sharing and all the modernization that we're hearing about on the show.
Which then, from a logical perspective, takes me back to the point that you made earlier about digital first. The only way to do that is to create a digital first environment, not just for the providers, but for the patients too. Am I on the right track there?
Spot on, spot on. And I don't think digital first starts and stops with electronic health modernization. I mean, we have a challenge in this country right now, right at this moment, where we have some 800,000 reservists that are not able to be deployed because they cannot get scheduled for their mental health and physical health assessments. And if we think about the geopolitics of what's going on in the world, we have to actively think about, a deployable, ready force today, right? So the electronic health record will not solve that. It will enable and create the next challenge, which is how do we get access at scale to people who need it. And so I think there's going to be a modernization of the way that we think about scheduling. If you have a 22-year-old active duty reservist or active duty deployed, they don't want to get on a phone and call that call center and push 0 a bunch of times to get to a human being. They immediately want to be able to access schedules of people in their area or virtually or remotely, whatever it may be, on their phone. That they literally grew up in an economy where they don't have to interact with anything but that. And so if we want to do that, we need to be able to accommodate that. If we have a 74-year-old veteran who does want to get on a phone, we should enable scheduling technology where they get on one call and they're not being called back, or they're not having to call in 3 times because they had to go track down a piece of information, but that one call is enabling the highly specialized complex care perhaps that they might need.
We have about a minute left, Andrea. As you move forward with a lot of these initiatives that you're talking about on this program and things that we've talked about in the past, how do you judge that what you've done is successful and that you can build on that and move to the next thing?
Oh gosh, that's a really good question. I think for me, part of what we're trying to do at CMS is build once, reuse many. So often for me, success is, okay, can we use this somewhere else in the agency? Can we reuse and recycle the software that we're building? Because a lot of these problems have been solved before, and I don't want to solve them again, right? So solve once, solve an issue, reuse that in different use cases. So that's usually my measure of success, and that's one of the reasons we've been so focused on open source, is because it allows us to see where's a tool that we might have in our toolbox that solved a similar problem before that we can just pick up and reuse rather than having to start from scratch.
Andrea and Sachin, it's great to have both of you on the program. Thanks very much for joining me today.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, appreciate it.
You can read more about open source and software in the health IT sector in government at fedgovtoday.com.